Thank you so much for staying here on the AM show. I'm Bernice Abu-Baidoo Lansah. Our government has finally concluded the second round of program negotiations with IMF in Washington in the United States of America. It, however, remains optimistic that it will be able to reach a deal with the fund for a program before the end of this year. Let's get on to Zoom and speak to my colleague, George Riafe, who is joining us live from the US for some details on exactly what happened. George, now, the big question is, will government be able to secure the deal by the close of this year? Hello, George. Sorry, we are unable to hear you. Hello, George. Hi, George. Apologies. We would have to work on George's line and get a good connection to him. Unfortunately, we're unable to hear him, but we still have Dr. Osai Kwapong, who is with the CDD, and Dr. Theo Champong standing by for a conversation on this. Let me just find out from you, gentlemen, your quick thoughts on our deliberations with the IMF so far. George was just about to answer the big question, whether we'll be able to secure a deal by close of year. I know that you've branched into the angle of the IMF helping to deal with our economic situation in the conversation that Benjamin just moderated a while ago. But we've heard from other experts who say, considering that the IMF is asking us to prove that we will be able to manage our debt properly before we will get a deal, and considering the bureaucracies that are involved in these kind of negotiations, it is not possible that we will get a deal by the end of the year. Let me just take your quick thoughts on that. Let me start with you, Dr. Theo Champong.
Thank you very much. So as you very much know, the debt sustainability analysis, which is basically trying to check whether you can service how much you owe. So in normal parlance, it's like a credit assessment if you went to the bank to borrow, would be able to tell you whether you're in a position to service your debt going forward. The IMF uses 4 benchmarks. You are classified as being low risk, moderate risk, high risk, or already in debt distress. And as of last year, Ghana was classified in the 3rd band of being at high risk of both overall as well as the external debt distress. And the analysis that they're doing now, they left the country a few weeks ago, would pretty much hinge or that determine the extent or the direction of the negotiations with the fund. The IMF and the World Bank use a similar DSA framework. And just last 2 weeks, the World Bank released a report that indicated that end of year, Ghana's debt to GDP, the total public debt, would have exceeded 100 or so, percent. And so for the fund now, off the back of the World Bank report, also to say, look, Ghana needs to prove that its debt is sustainable, which would include the exposures to the state-owned enterprises, things like that. I think what that tells us is that as more data is actually being required or requested of the state agencies, and therefore the likelihood of concluding the deal before the end of the year probably might slip a little bit going into next year, because everything is really contingent on that debt sustainability analysis. And we've seen this in Zambia's case, where it took well over 2 years to conclude a deal with the fund off the back of a similar debt sustainability analysis and eventual sort of debt restructuring with some of the external creditors.
Right. But for you, Dr. Osai Kwapong, what will your response be? Hello, Doc? Do we still have Dr. Kwapong on? Hello, Doc. Can you kindly unmute so we can hear what you're saying, please?
I think Dr. Kwapon is kind of gone off briefly.
All right, it appears so, and I was just being giving some information on what exactly is happening. Okay, so let me continue with you and about the projections about our debt to GDP ratio. The IMF is projecting that it will hit about 90.7%. The IMF has also said that next year will be like a recession for most countries. Are you convinced that we will be able to improve the economy once we get this deal, considering the hints that the IMF has given?
There are big headwinds globally, and many analysts, many of the big global banks, including the IMF, are forecasting a potential slowdown or recession at a global level next year. But even with or without a recession, certain countries are still expected to grow, including in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think the jury really is out on that. And I expect the Ghanaian economy, of course, to grow, but not, of course, at the levels, the 7-6% that we hitherto used to see, probably between 4.5, 5.5% thereabouts in that regard, which is still a fairly kind of modest growth in that respect. And that would also then be contingent on the actual package that we agreed to with the IMF. The IMF deal is not necessarily about the money that is going to come in, because we're not going to get all the 3 billion in one go. It's going to be in tranches, probably about $300 million at the go, and the rest will be contingent on how we meet the program benchmarks. But the most important thing that the deal would do is to send a signal to market players that we are wanting to turn the tide. We want to get the fiscal overruns, the expenditure issues, increase revenue, address the vulnerabilities with our state-owned enterprises. All those things really are the core of what the program would look like. But it's really about the policy signaling. I think less so with actual quantum of money that we would get.
During the time we were informed about government's decision to go to the IMF, the Information Minister, Kojo Nkrumah, mentioned that this is not the only measure government is hoping to introduce to deal with our current economic crisis. He says, well, going to the IMF is just for balance of payment issues, but there were going to be other measures which include, revenue mobilization to help us deal with our current economic problems. For you, Doc, what are the homegrown issues that we must focus on? Or what are the homegrown policies that we must introduce to supplement the gains the IMF deal will give us?
So already the government is talking about an economic or enhanced domestic program. I think for me, there are probably 5 or 4 things that is important and which would also be really core to the IMF program. Number one, on the revenue administration front, how to increase the revenue base from the 14 or so percent of GDP to about 18, 20% over the medium term. I think within that bucket, the e-levy, we should think about refining that. I think the issue of the tax exemptions and the implementation of the tax exemption law, the bill that was passed a few months ago, becomes quite critical. I think the issue of the leakages also at our ports of entry within the revenue framework also is quite important. And then even within the extractive sector, the mining, oil and gas, the types of contract that we're signing, there's a possibility to ensure alignment and ensure that we can sort of get more within that sector and address some of the issues with cost inflation and also sort of transfer pricing. Then second one is on the expenditure side of the equation, and this is where I think that a lot of big cuts to government spending would have to be done. Probably a limit on hiring within certain sectors of the public services. We saw that happen in the last program. I think some of the flagship initiatives, probably there's an avenue to rationalize some of the costs there. And then importantly, on our state-owned enterprises as well. Third bit on debt management. Here, I think the discussion, as we already have seen, is about extending the duration of the amount that we owe or the total public debt, and there's negotiations on both the external and the domestic front in relation to that. But overall, it's about how to improve fiscal discipline, both in terms of budget transparency and budget credibility. And that's really going to be at the heart of our domestic program that we seek to implement, of course, supported by the IMF.
Right, Doctor. Thankfully, we have George Riafe back on with us. He's been monitoring government engagement with the IMF in the United States of America. George, so the big question is, will government be able to secure that deal before the end of the year? Hello, George. It appears that the problem still persists with George and our inability to hear him. We'll try again to rectify that problem. But let me come to Dr. Osei Kwapo. So, Doc, I've been engaging Dr. Theo Champong, and he just got off from responding to the question about what local remedies can we introduce to deal with our current economic problem while we wait for that deal from the IMF.
Yes, so I mean, he did outline quite a number of options available in terms of the things that government needs to pay attention to on the domestic, factors that is contributing to some of these economic challenges. I want to reiterate the point he raised about expenditure. The challenge, though, with government expenditure is, so if you go back and you look at the 2022 budget, the projected deficit at that time was about 37 billion. This is even counting in the fact that they were hoping they would raise the necessary revenues from the e-levy. If you take the e-levy projections out of it, it took the deficit to almost about 40-something billion. If you slash all of government discretionary spending, right, it's key government initiatives, things that it's good to do but they don't have to do, it still doesn't make much of a dent in the budget on the expenditure side. Those flagship programs, if I recall correctly, I don't think was going to cost any more than 5 or 6 billion cedis, which means that you're still in the hole for about at least another 30 billion. That moves you into another different territory, which is, what are you willing to then cut now? You can't say that you're not going to pay your interest on the debt anymore. And then you also cannot, get into the territory of another huge chunk of our budget, which is what we spend on wages and salaries. So the expenditure side will still be very difficult, but I agree with Dr. Theo that you still have to find a way to do something about that expenditure side of it. But you also cannot ignore the political consequences of cutting back on some of those things. But domestically, I would share Dr. Theo's sentiments of some of the things he's pointed out as it. Ultimately, I think there's also a political dimension to all of this. And by the political dimension, I mean it is even how we manage citizens' expectations, how we communicate to citizens, in terms of this entire process, that I think would also be very important to be done on the domestic front, because these things would would take us through a period of further pinch points before things could and could hopefully get better. And in that process, you cannot leave a vacuum in which you're not engaging citizens and trying to make sure that you also smooth their pain through even regular conversations, regular updates. Because at this point, there's a sort of a vacuum that makes you say to yourself, we're facing all of these challenges, and what is actually being done. I'm sure in the background, the negotiations are going on, the conversations are going on, but there has to be a public face to all of this that assures citizens that the government is in tune, is attentive, is paying attention, and is working on doing something to address the current challenges. And I think for me, that is also part of what we have to do on the domestic front as we engage in these IMF negotiations.
Earlier this week, President Akufo-Addo spoke in Kumasi, and he mentioned that, well, this is one of the, he admits that this was a hard decision to take, I mean, going to the IMF, and he spoke about what he believes is the main driver for what we are suffering here. He says that the prices of crude oil on the international market is affecting us woefully and adding to our economic woes. What beyond that do you expect? The president has given a hint of how he feels about the whole process, but because of what you said earlier, I'd just like you to give us further details on what exactly you mean by the citizen must be engaged in the entire process.
So if you look at months ago when the decision was first announced that we are going to seek an IMF bailout, the Ministry of Finance did something very important. They actually put a document together, a frequently asked questions, right? And it detailed at least about 10 to, I think, about 15 questions where it said, why are we doing this? What are the consequences for doing this? What does this mean for some of our social protection programs? Does it mean that government will do X, Y, and Z? And I thought that was a very brilliant document to put together, right? As a way of engaging citizens on this whole IMF process. But since then, you don't really hear much. And that's the vacuum that I'm speaking to, which is, this is a very difficult decision. And because it's a very difficult decision, you can't just leave citizens on their own to say, well, we told you we are going to go for the IMF bailout and end of story. I think that you need that regular citizen engagement through some of the platforms that sometimes government uses, whether it's the ministerial briefings, whether it's the president engaging directly with the public at some point, with constant updates and regular assurances that, again, we are paying attention and something will be done. Yes, assurances alone do not solve problems, but for me, there's a perception part in politics where you cannot ignore, right? You cannot have citizens feeling that we are going through all of this and we don't seem to be getting any signals from the government that they are going to respond or they are paying attention. And that's the piece that I'm referring to, that you need to find constant engagement with citizens around these issues, particularly in these difficult times.
Let me just throw this in about our cedi's performance against the dollar. Some government officials say what is happening is due to speculation. It's caused by a lot of speculation on the market. Do you agree?
I'm sure there's an element to that, but I think for me, our exchange rate issues also boils down to a basic issue of demand and supply, right? If you have strong demand for the dollar and the supply of the dollar is not meeting that, then obviously you should expect that the exchange rate would go up. I'm sure on the currency market there's some speculation that goes on, right? People who hedge bets, who bet that this thing might go up, and some of that also does drive. I mean, all of those dynamics, I'm sure, drives the currency market. So there's a bit of that also that fuels the exchange rate. But I think ultimately It's more of a demand and supply issue. And if the supply side is not strong enough to meet the demand, then you run into the sort of situation that you run into. As I previously mentioned, there are times where when there is inflow of dollars, it does tame the currency market a little bit. But this time, I'm actually not observing that impact from the loan facility we got a couple of months ago. I think it was KDB, and then the announcement of the cocoa board syndicated loan with the opening of the new cocoa season. I'm not seeing a dent in that, so that becomes a little worrying in terms of what exactly is going on. I think I saw a Joy report that also talked about a Bank of Ghana auctioning of dollars and the shortfall in terms of the demand. I think the demand for the dollars in relation to how much the central bank was able to provide, there was quite a gap of several, I think, millions of dollars or something, if I'm correct. So again, that demand and supply dynamic, I think, is what is really driving some of the movements in the exchange rate that we're seeing.
Right. Let's now get some details from our business editor, George Riafe, who's been monitoring events in the U.S. for us between government and the IMF. Hopefully we'll hear him this time round. Hello, George. George, if you can hear me.
Hello, can you hear me?
Great. Thankfully we can. Just help us answer the biggest question on a lot of people's minds now. Will government secure the IMF deal before the close of the year?
It's $1 billion question, Bernice. And if you engage most of the officials from the perspective of the IMF, I mean, they are committed from their body language and everything. But if I should quote the director of the African department of the IMF, again, that will be dependent on government's willingness to implement those critical reforms that should come with the program. And therefore, if government is committed to undertake those reforms, and also what will be the outcome of the ongoing debt sustainability analysis, then maybe we could get a deal before the close of this year.
So we are still not certain as we speak, and we are in the third week of October. Well, so behind the scenes, George, what has the IMF and World Bank officials, what have they been saying about Ghana and our program in terms of what you're picking, off the record, not on record stuff?
Well, Bennett, you get the sense of the fund and the World Bank arguing that they want Ghana to succeed, seen as the rising star of Africa, the shining star of Africa. So you get that sense that they want us to succeed, and therefore they are willing to do whatever they have to do to let this thing come to pass. I mean, recently, again, in engagement with the African department, he made an argument that, listen, we were prepared to fast track the process for Ghana to close a deal. So these are what you get from them, their commitment for some of things need to happen. But the reality is that there are critical benchmarks or checkbox that we have to go through. And I don't think that because it's Ghana, all the rules are going to be bent or actually scrubbed for us to secure a program. When they go to the board, the staff goes to the board with their report. One critical question that the board would ask the staff is that how sustainable is our debt and how is government committed to also undertake those reforms? And if government is committed from their body language, again, it comes back to, again, taking those very tough measures that will help us get this program.
George, beyond the issue of our debt sustainability, what other issues came up during the negotiation?
Well, you get the sense that it's all about debt, and also the political world, and also how we're going to ensure that there is a collective ownership of the program. So it's not just about the executive, but about parliament, the broader people, and also civil society engagement as well.
Interesting. There's also the projection about our GDP hitting some 90.7% by end of the year, and I'm sure concerns were also raised about that. Our debt to
And then
GDP ratio, yeah.
that feeds into the current debt sustainability analysis that is going on right now. Because again, if your debt is unsustainable, that would actually shape the program and how things to go, and some tough things that has to be undertaken with respect to what is going to be a crash program. Already we are getting the sense that we may have a very tough fiscal, or use the word fiscal consolidated program, means that you're going to have some more of an austere budget. So that feeds into what will be the impact on our debt DSC that is currently going on if the fund is projecting that debt will hit 90% of our GDP, signaling some tough times for us going forward, Bernice.
So what's next for government, George?
For the next is that the negotiations come back to Ghana. The finance minister at the Bank of Ghana is supposed to put together what they call a letter of intention, officially written to the managing director of the IMF. Now, that will state or tell the fund, what are your intentions? Why are you applying for this program? Again, what reforms are you prepared to undertake? And also, you understand that a full economic document will be presented to the fund. That tells us the reform they are going to undertake. And so that is supposed to be done before the end of this month. And that will give us a better picture. And then there's one critical thing that we all are excited that there'll be more transparency. You and I are going to get more details on our economy that we're not used to be getting. And just like what Dr. Tio Champon said, it's not just about the about 4 billion that the fund is going to give to government, but also the commitment for some reforms that are going to be undertaken. The World Bank is going to come on board with some extra funds. The other donor partners are also going to come on board. So roughly we'll be hitting about $10 billion spread over these years. So that is what is next for Ghana. And again, the backstops of government about whether they are committed to undertake those reforms that will be associated with this program.
George, the finance minister and his team were in the US. Were you able to get a word or two from them, especially on how this whole debt sustainability and expectations of the IMF will feed into our budget in November?
Well, on the bit about the debt sustainability, anytime you throw that question to them, their response is that there's a DSA going on. Unless the DSA is completed, they wouldn't have any comments to make on that one. And it will be premature for them. That's the response they give you. On the budget spend, is what we can say is that the fund or the IMF will be heavy in this budget. Already we are getting the sense that it will be an austere budget, more of fast-tracking some fiscal consolidation program, and that is what we'll be getting from the team that is working on the budget. Don't forget that the Financial Management Act, the finance minister is supposed to present this budget not later than November 31 to Parliament. And so we're going to see more of a hand of the IMF in this program or this budget the finance minister will be laying to Parliament not later than 31st of November 2022.
And George, finally, before I let you go, is the team aware of what is happening in Ghana while they are away, shops being closed due to the current economic conditions? And have you been able to get any reactions or response from any member of the team on this?
The bit about the shops, because the team, we were on a separate mission. The delegates also doing their own thing. We didn't come to them. We came here independently. But what you get, the bit that I got to throw to the team has to do with the Ghana city.
Okay.
And one breath, they bring this IMF program on board. That is why they are trying to fast track the IMF negotiations. That the fund coming on board might help deal with this problem. But also, there's another side where, quoting directly the Minister of State at the Ministry of Finance, Dubois, who argued that he feels that speculatory activities are feeding into what is happening to the Ghana city, and that it's not necessarily about a challenging fiscal situation. And so the fear that things are going to get worse, people betting on things getting worse, and that is feeding into the current pressure on the Ghana city. So they don't think that it's an issue about a fiscal, but rather a more of speculatory activities feeding into the current pressure on the Ghana cedi.
We'll leave it here. George Riafe is our business editor, and he's been giving us details on the World Bank IMF summit in the U.S. We know that the finance minister and his team have been engaging with the IMF on how to get a deal for us as soon as possible. We're unable to tell if it will happen by the end of the year, even though government has shown optimism that it will. We're yet to see what happens. So let me come back to you, Dr. Theo Champong. You've heard everything that George has said. For you as an individual, how does it make you feel about the prospects for us?
Prospects are challenging.
Sorry, Doc, I didn't get your initial response.
Okay. I said that the prospects have always been challenging, and these headwinds have been there. And like George indicated, there are a number of points that the IMF is looking at, but fundamentally it comes down to government of Ghana and its position and its ability and willingness to be open about certain data points and what sort of program it wants to engage the fund with. So for me, I am very much looking forward to the 2023 budget, because that really would tell the direction in which we are going to go over the next year or two. But definitely, I think there is some sort of austerity around the corner, and we should all sort of buckle up our belts.
What are you expecting to see in that budget? I mean, on the top of your mind, considering all that we've discussed and all that lies ahead of us, what are some of the things that you'd expect to see in the next budget?
On the social spending side, the extent to which government would be able to keep its commitment under things like the LEAP program will be quite important, because that's for a lot of our folks further down the social ladder. It'll be important for them. I think the two other things I've talked about on the revenue side, what new revenue initiatives we're going to undertake to increase the broad base, but increase the tax to GDP ratio. And then on the expenditure side, what are we going to have to give in return to ensure that we live within our means? Other than that, we will finish this program and we'll be here 5 years down the line, and we'll be talking about the 18th or the 19th IMF package.
Dr. Saikapong, former President Mahama has suggested that maybe a cut in expenditure at the presidency will help in dealing with our expenditure issues. What's your take on that, and what are your expectations for the 2023 budget?
Well, I think at this point, again, on the expenditure side, whatever we can do to tame that part of our budget, for me, is always a welcome suggestion. So if it's the budget at the presidency, if there's other areas in the budget that we can really look to and make some reasonable cuts, that I think those things are always welcome suggestions. Overall, my expectation, I'm really hoping that sooner rather than later, we will be able to secure a deal with the IMF. Because again, as we keep observing, the challenges keep mounting, the pressures keep mounting, on the economic front. So hopefully, whatever the difficult points of negotiations are, I'm hoping that all of those can be resolved so that an acceptable program will be able to put forth by the government, and a deal will be struck. Because again, we can't keep just riding the storm without some specific actions. And as Dr. Champong said, the 2023 budget would also be key in terms of, that would demonstrate the actual steps that, the government would be saying, this is how we hope, to deal with the current difficulties. But I'm hopeful that, something would come out, and in the long term, as you said, hopefully we won't have to run back again, and this one time we would get it right and fix, all the structural and other issues that bedevil us.
We'll be wrapping up shortly, but quite recently we've seen the GRA go full force on tax compliance, and we know that that is also geared at increasing our revenue and also widening the tax net. We know some shops were closed because they were not employing the digital form of indicating the VATs as against the sales that they make. We have had this discussion quite a number of times about sealing the loopholes and widening the tax net. There are those who are not too keen about widening the tax net per se, but they believe that sealing the loopholes will give us exactly what we need in dealing with revenue mobilization in this country. In Kumasi, for example, we saw shops closing due to the economic conditions, and also because the traders say they were not enthused about the fact that there were GRA officials there manually taking stock and ensuring that the government got its due per the sales that were made. How do you think we can really work at creating, no system is perfect, but creating a very good system that allows us to take the right amount of taxes and also seal the loopholes that exist?
That's a tough one, but some of these e-measures, some of these electronic measures, I think are steps in the right direction. Right? You really want to make sure that those on whom you assess various kinds of taxes are actually meeting their tax obligations, and there are no sort of mechanisms through which they can bypass the tax system. And so if electronic measures, digital measures would help to ensure full tax, or at least as much tax compliance as we can, then I think that that's a step in the right direction. I just think that sometimes with the rollout of some of these administrative procedures around something as critical as taxes, I think engaging the stakeholders and making them a little more sensitization to get them to the point where they can fully understand the impetus of that approach, I believe helps. But I think if we can really use some of these digital tools, e-tools, to help with tax compliance, that would be critically important. In situations where digital measures may not help, you also want to count on strong public education and why it is important to meet all your tax obligations to the state. How you also tax the informal sector of the economy also becomes another way of dealing with some of these revenue challenges when it comes to taxation. But for me, at this point, all of these steps that the GRA is thinking about and trying to implement has a good policy intention behind it, which is we really want to make sure that we are collecting taxes as effectively and as efficiently as possible.
Doc, it's interesting you bring the bit on digitization because that's where I was going to next. This government has been very forceful on that drive, and we were told, digitization was supposed to help us deal with some of these issues. And also on the issue of gathering data, I remember in one of his public speeches, the Vice President mentioned how important data was to policy creation and where we meet ourselves. Considering that earlier in that conversation with Benjamin, we mentioned the issue of the policy rate being increased and how that was supposed to solve a problem, and we're still having that problem, indicating that it is possible that we misdiagnosed the problem. What will your assessment of government's digitization and data drive be, considering that we don't seem to see a lot of positive results in that regard?
Well, some of these initiatives also do take time to realize its full benefits. So I think it's a right approach. If you can really employ the tools of digitalization, there's a lot of benefits that you can reap, into an economy. So you have to sort of give it some time for it to quote unquote fully work out. On the data piece, you're correct. Data-driven policy decision is very critical in any governance setup, in any business setup. And I know that, for example, the central bank's approach to the monetary policy rate is driven by its concerns about inflation. But at some point, I'm sure the Bank of Ghana itself hopefully would step back and reflect on what the data trends is showing in terms of the relationship between the increases in the monetary policy rate and why we are still unable to tame inflation, and then be able to adjust, its policy. But Dr. Theo is more of an expert on
Exactly,
those,
and I was going to him in wrapping up the conversation, Dr. Theo Champong. Dr. Osai Kwapong has thrown this ball in your court, but help us understand. I mean, Dr. Osai Kwapong says, "Oh, this will take a long time for us to reap the benefits." But what is your assessment of our data and digitization drive in helping to deal with some of our economic issues that we suffer in this country?
Yeah, I mean, we agree across the board that it's a step in the right direction. I think we actually have seen some positives already. If you look at what's happening at the DVLA passport and a few other places which in the policy balance, we call it pockets of efficiency. You can actually see in a few places that drive, beginning to actually yield results with the IGFs, the internally generated fund that these organizations are collecting. But the bigger issue is really the harmony or how the policies are synergized together at a much broader level. And that's where some of the challenges still lie, because really it goes to the heart of how you're able to use that data to drive the policies that you're making. And clearly, the data to drive the policy on, say, e-levy was lacking, because if the data was there and if they had followed it, they wouldn't have introduced some of the 1.5 or whatever percent that was introduced. So you can see in some sense, yes, small gains, but at a bigger level, there's still challenges. You see that again with even the mobile number registration thing that is going on.
The SIM card re-registration.
Right, where the national whatever authority that has the mandate to print the Ghana card.
National Identification Authority, NIA.
Identification is still not done. It's a process that's ongoing. But we want to use a very hard administrative fiat to say that if you haven't registered your number by a certain timeline, then you're going to be cut off from the network. So you see a lot of policy inconsistencies, incoherence across the board. And lastly, when you now talk about using that data to drive the tax mobilization effort, I think there are two things there. Definitely, we need to increase the tax compliance, but we also need to expand the tax base, particularly those within the informal sector of the economy. And that is where that data collection becomes really, really key. So things like the Ghana card and linking that to your tax registration and all of those things within a much bigger ecosystem becomes important. But it's about synergies, and it's about ensuring that the policies are not implemented, one, in an ad hoc manner, and then number two, doesn't disenfranchise a segment of the population that you want to help in the first place.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Dr. Theo Champong is a finance analyst, and Dr. Osai Kwapong is a fellow with the CDD. Earlier, we had George Riafe joining us from Washington, D.C., giving us details of government's IMF negotiations and all you need to know about it here on the AM show. We'll take a quick breather. We'll be back with more. Do stay.